Why Evolution is True, Chapter 7, The Origin of Species. Ernst Mayr, a German zoologist, set off to the wilds of Dutch New Guinea in 1927 to collect plants and animals. Within a span of 2 years, he brought back and named 26 species of birds and 38 species of orchids, which helped him produce and publish a vast number of books, one of which is called The Animal Species and Evolution, which convinced John Cohn, the author of Why Evolution is True, to produce the study of evolution. Ernst Mayr also defined species as a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other groups. This is also known as the biological species concept. He also said, not only do species look morphologically similar, they can only breed among themselves. As accredited, luckily, he did have the financial backing of Lord Walker Rothschild, a banker who owned the world's largest private collection of bird specimens. If he did not have this financial backing, none of this would have been possible.
Animal Species and Evolution, written by Ernst Mayr, contains a description of evolutionary biology. It also contains a critical evaluation of the knowledge about nature of the species of animals and evolution. Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, and he explained why a single species changes over time due to natural selection. However, he failed to explain why a single species evolves and splits into two different ones. He also failed to explain nature's clusters in a coherent way, and he did not see the discontinuities of nature as a problem to be solved. He believed that discontinuities were favored by natural selection.
Nature is discontinuous. The discontinuities of nature are not arbitrary, but an objective fact. As an example, natives of New Guinea Arfak Mountains identified 136 species of birds, and at the same time, Western zoologists also identified 137 species using taxonomy. This helped prove to Mayr that nature's discontinuities are not arbitrary, but an objective fact. There is variation among individuals within a cluster. The clusters nevertheless remain discrete in organism space. Clusters in all organisms that reproduce sexually are known as species, and species at first sight is a problem for the evolutionary theory, because evolution is a continuous process. But species are groups of animals and plants that are discrete and discontinuous, separate from others by gaps in appearance and behavior, which is caused by speciation.
Species did not arise as Darwin initially thought. Species are evolutionary accidents or clusters that are important for biodiversity and do not evolve because they increase the diversity, nor do they evolve to provide a balanced ecosystem. Evolution is a continuous process, but species are groups of animals and plants that are discrete and discontinuous, separated from other gaps in appearance and behavior caused by speciation. This is just as important as understanding how a single species evolves, since diversity of nature encompasses millions of species. Each species have their own unique set of traits derived from a single ancestor.
The morphological species concept is when individuals of a species are morphologically similar to one another, yet distinct from other species. In other words, if body shapes, sizes, and other structural features and characteristics would be used to characterize and categorize species. This applies both to asexual and sexual organisms. It justifies through evidence of observation that species are defined by appearance and their characteristics are indicators of interbreeding. This is extremely useful when the information of gene flow is unknown. However, there is a few drawbacks. As said before, the drawbacks are that a morphological species can be subjective to the viewer, and therefore researchers or anyone who is trying to classify a certain species may disagree on which features to use to distinguish a species. For example, sexually dimorphic species, males and females, will look different as seen in these peacocks here. Right there. And furthermore, mimicry will also lead to one species looking like the other, but they are separate species.
There's two types of mimicry that can happen as a result. There's Müllerian mimicry and Batesian mimicry. The two types of mimicry that can happen are Müllerian mimicry and Batesian mimicry. Müllerian mimicry is when two or more distasteful species that may or may not be closely related and share one or more common predators have come to mimic each other's warning signals. Batesian mimicry is a form of mimicry where a harmless species has evolved to imitate the warning signals of a harmful species directed at a predator of them both.
The biological species concept defines a species as members of populations that actually or potentially interbreed in nature instead of similarities or appearance. While appearance is helpful, it does not define them. Organisms may appear to be of the same species, yet be two different species, such as the western and eastern meadowlarks. They look identical, but they are different species. They do not interbreed with each other. Organisms may also look different, yet be the same species, such as the ants here, which are both fatal barbata, and they live in the same colony but perform different roles. The lack of interbreeding between different species living in the same area maintains the fact that differences in appearance and behavior allows divergence without limitation. The biological species concept has its advantages and disadvantages. Its advantage being that it makes up for the disadvantages of the morphological species concept. Disadvantages include not applying to extinct organisms because they cannot be tested for reproductive capabilities. It is difficult to apply asexual organisms who look identical. Geographical barriers and chrono species, which are species that are different stages in the same evolving lineage that existed at different points in time, which leaves a question of interbreeding. Sister species are the closest relatives to another species that are often separated by geographical barriers. These geographical barriers split one species into two species, making them their own closest relative.
The formation of new species is called speciation, which is rather difficult to explain until the 1930s.
Hey, you kids, stay out of my butt!
Sorry, Mr. Potato Head.
Speciation is an evolutionary process by which reproductively isolated biological populations evolve to become distinct species. There are three modes of speciation: allopatric, parapatric, and sympatric. Allopatric speciation occurs when biological populations of the same species become vicariant or isolated from each other to an extent that prevents or interferes with genetic interchange. Parapatric speciation occurs when a population of a species constitutes one or more biogeographically distinct subpopulations with a small, continuous overlap or minimal contact zone between populations. Finally, sympatric speciation occurs when new species evolve from a single ancestral species while inhabiting the same geographic region. Speciation does not arise for the purpose of filling empty niches, but it could be a result from genetic barriers or geographic barriers. Coyne and Allen Orr calculated that one ancestor would take around 100,000 to 5 million years to evolve into two separate species. Ernst Mayr argued that reproductive barriers were merely byproducts of natural and sexual selection that caused geographically isolated populations to evolve in different locations. In the book, Coyne uses hummingbirds and bees to explain specialization of flowers and pollinators. Flowers that inhabit an area with a large hummingbird population would evolve specific features to attract them. The flower would be red in color, produce copious nectar, and develop deep tubes. All these attributes are to attract, reward, and accommodate the hummingbird. Flowers that inhabit an area where bees are the major pollinating population would evolve features targeted towards them. These flowers would be pink in color, have shallow nectar tubes, and have flatter petals that form a landing platform. These two populations of flowers would eventually become specialized for pollination by only one single type of animal over time. If these flower populations came across one another, where bees and hummingbirds coexisted equally, their genes would not be able to mix via cross-pollination. They would have become two different species.
The theory of geographic speciation requires that a population be geographically isolated first. This leads to reproductive isolation and therefore new species. Examples of geographic barrier could be anything like a mountain, rivers, deserts, glaciers, continents drifting. While it is difficult for speciation to occur without a geographic barrier, It does happen, and this is called sympatric speciation. Reproductive isolation is when two populations are unable to breed or produce fertile offspring. This can arise from several things, such as the evolution of different mating locations, or different mating times, or different mating rituals. It can also occur when sexual organs just don't fit, or when offspring can be had but they are sterile. This does not apply to asexual organisms. Reproductive isolation arises when geographic barriers form, but even if the geographic barrier is removed, the species would still be reproductively isolated as long as speciation had occurred.
Divergent selection is the process where interbreeding species diverges or separates into two or more descendant species, resulting in a once similar species to become more dissimilar. There are potential barriers such as reproductive barriers, geographical barriers, and isolating barriers. Reproductive barriers is when mating or flower seasons do not overlap between species, or they may display different mating rituals or release different pheromones that may seem to be unattractive to the other. Geographical species is a physical barrier where habitats prevent species from encountering each other. And isolating barriers are when mutations occur because there is a possibility of different mutations that can affect male behaviors or traits and could appear in different places, which reflect on mating preferences. There can also be due to poor maladaptive and wasteful features such as sterility and inviability of hybrid due to natural selection and genetic drift.
Sympatric speciation is the formation of species without geographical barriers. This is difficult because selection has to work against interbreeding. Sympatric speciation is possible under restrictive conditions uncommon in nature, and this is proven by mathematical theories. Some examples of the sympatric speciation occurring are the cichlid fish in tiny Cameroon lakes. These lakes are 0.2 and 1.6 square mile lakes. One lake has 11 species and other 9 from recently descended common ancestor. Considering the size of these lakes, it is difficult to believe that speciation would have occurred. But sympatric speciation did in fact occur, which accounts for the diversity in these two tiny lakes. Sympatric speciation has two different types, autopolyploidy and allopolyploidy, which we will talk about further into the slides. Polyploid speciation is a form of sympatric speciation, and there are two types, allopolyploidy and autopolyploidy. Polyploid speciation involves a change in chromosome number rather than changes in the genes. This speciation needs the formation and union of sperm and egg with an abnormally high number of chromosomes. This is common in plants, but rare with animals. This is due to the fact that plants can produce millions of eggs and pollen grain. Makes this rare occurrence probable for plants. With animals, it is occasional in fish, insects, worms, and reptiles, though rare. Allopolyploids begin with the hybridization of two different species in the same area. These species usually have different number of chromosomes, which would lead to an improper pairing of chromosomes, which leads to sterility. But via error or mutation of the hybrid's chromosomes, this would lead to viability of their offspring. Autopolyploids, unlike allopolyploids, do not require hybridization. Autopolyploids arise from a single species that doubles their own chromosomes. This produces fertile hybrids when mating with other autopolyploids. Sterile hybrids if mated with parent species.
Biodiversity allows for new traits to rise, and it is directly related to speciation. If there is no speciation, there is no biodiversity, and biodiversity is a variety of life. It can be studied on many levels. At the highest level, you can look at all different species on the entire Earth. On a much smaller scale, you can study biodiversity within a pond, another ecosystem, or a neighborhood park. Identifying and understanding the relationships between all life on Earth are some of the greatest challenges in science. And thank you for watching.